Well, thank you all for coming on this beautiful fall day. So we are extremely fortunate to have Mr. Darren Bonaparte speaking for us this afternoon. He has traveled from the Akiatonharónkwen Reserve at the New York-Quebec border, and his day job is as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Mohawk or Akiatonharónkwen Nation. And in that role, he consults on two primary, or perhaps three primary things, many cultural resource management projects in the United States that are required by historic preservation regulations. And he also consults on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the NAGPRA law, and its implementation, and that involves the repatriation of human remains as well as funerary objects. But it also now involves consultation on appropriate stewardship of archaeological and ethnological objects from the Mohawk homelands, which of course extends from northern New York down into the Mohawk Valley. When he's not doing his very demanding day job, Darren is a prolific author and speaker. He's constantly writing and speaking on Mohawk history and identity. And the simplest way to access many of his writings is simply to Google the Wampum Chronicles. And most of his writings are there and easily accessible. He's also an author of several books, and the most recent of these is The Early History of Akiatonharónkwen, and that's available for folks who are here today. You can get a signed copy of that after his presentation. Today, Darren will be speaking with us about warrior of the Revolution, Colonel Lewis Cook of the Seven Nations of Canada. He was a significant figure in the American Revolution. He defied alliances and played a crucial role in the Continental Army, navigating complex relationships with both British and American forces. And this lecture that Darren will provide to us today explores his life, his rivalry with Joseph Brant, and his lasting impact on New York State. So please welcome Darren.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm not like Donald Trump. I don't care about crowd size whatsoever. If one person shows up, they're getting the show. That's the way I've always operated, and I'm going to continue with that. So thank you all for making me a part of your Sunday. It's a beautiful day outside, yet you chose to come inside under artificial lighting and to enjoy some history chat. I normally am not a podium guy. I'm certainly not a PowerPoint guy. That's my PowerPoint right there. So fortunately, this time out, I can stand at a podium and talk into this wonderful microphone. And my subject matter is near and dear to my heart. Let me just give you a little background on myself. I really caught the history bug more than 30 years ago. And when you're young and you're very impressionable, you're always like just yearning for some kind of hero figures. When I was about 11 years old, Charlton Heston had a movie called The Battle of Midway. And some of you older folks might remember that one. But the Battle of Midway was the big epic turning point in World War II. And me and my cousin Todd, who was just a couple years younger than me, Todd's father, Uncle Irving, was a Navy veteran during the Vietnam War era. So he encouraged us to be little World War II history buffs. And so we were building model aircraft carriers and little fighter planes. So we knew all the different kinds of planes that fought at Midway, the Avenger torpedo bombers, the Dauntless SBD dive bombers. I know all that stuff, man. And all the carriers that were at the battle. So that was our big thing. Then Star Wars came along about a year later and just blew all them battleships right out of the water. So I was a history buff until Star Wars came along. Then I was a sci-fi buff. Then I found out about heavy metal. We were listening to Beach Boys records, and then all of a sudden my neighbors came in with Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin, and that was the end of the Beach Boys. They got blown right out of the water. So I was into heavy metal and science fiction, and I began my writing career in high school, writing the great American novel as written by a Canadian Indian from Akwesasne. And it was all about, since I love science fiction and heavy metal music, about a heavy metal band that goes into outer space. I know, it sounds dumb now, but at the time it seemed pretty serious to me. So that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer more than anything else on this planet. I was originally an artist, as is my whole family. My brother Brad was quite the legendary artist in our community. And so, but that was him. He was the older brother, went to art school, and for some reason I did not want to go to art school. It broke the heart of my art teacher, but I said I want to be a writer, and I want to do other things than just draw pictures, because that's my brother. He's doing that. I can't just be copycat of my older brother. And so what happened was in my community, Akwesasne, we're a Mohawk community, but it was originally a Catholic mission. And all the communities on the St. Lawrence River, Ganawage, Ganasatake, and some of the other mission communities, we were all Catholic. And up until my generation, it seems like just about everybody in our community was Catholic. It's just the way it was. A few Methodists, a few whatever. But there's this small longhouse traditional community that was in our midst, but we didn't know anything about it. We were not exposed to it. My family, my grandparents and them, they were not tolerable about that stuff. Not that they were militant about it or anything like that. But my brother went to art school, came home, got a job at a cultural center in Akwesasne, and that immersed him in the traditional longhouse community. So he started off just drawing pictures and posters. Then he became a travel troupe guy, singing, dancing, telling stories. He just plunged into it. And he was 10 times more the public speaker that I am. And so that was his thing. And one day he said to me, why don't you become a wampum belt maker? He said, there's so many things that people are reviving in the culture. The songs, the dances, the ceremonies, the language, the crafts, you name it. Everybody's on something. But nobody's doing wampum belt reproductions. And he said, for the longest time, that was a thing. At all the cultural centers in Akwesasne, is they researched wampum belts, and they made glass bead replicas of those belts. And there had been a school teacher at Akwesasne in the 1930s and onward named Ray Fadden. And he was one of those rare people who came into our community, and instead of saying, you need to forget this old Indian stuff, this jumping around and gallivanting, and get with the program, he was the opposite of that. He was more like, no, you need to know that culture. It's a magnificent, beautiful culture. Embrace it. Promote it, keep it going, keep it strong. And so people took him to heart and did the same thing. So he made at least 80 wampum belt replicas. And he also wrote a booklet about wampum. And he became an old man, and he's gone now. But I know his grandson and his son, who also passed away, John Fadden, one of the most influential Haudenosaunee artists of all time, by far. And Dave is no slouch in the art department either. Great artist. Wonderful. And so that's the community that I'm in now, is a community that celebrates traditional culture. Whereas when I was a kid, that was like a thing to walk away from, to don't even know about it. In fact, in our curriculum, we didn't know anything about history. It was our culture or anything like that. It was just not talked about. Even in social studies, which is you're required to know about Native stuff, we didn't really get that much. So for my brother to discover the culture around him that had been kind of not present for him, kind of enticed me to find my little niche of the culture. Where am I going to fit in? So I decided I'm going to become a historian of our community. And I got started in the late 80s, early 90s. And in our community, we had a big civil war over casino gaming, illegal speakeasies, and warrior society activities. And it got really, there was also black market smuggling and stuff like that. So the decade of the 1980s, when I was in high school and just graduating, it was a lawless reservation. The American side of Akwesasne had no police, and it had just gone haywire. So when all of that blew up in violence on May 1st, 1990, my best friend, who was my next door neighbor and my cousin, my sidekick, was one of the two guys who was killed in the violence at Akwesasne. His name was Matthew Pike. And that was devastating to lose my best friend. I've never had a best friend since. When you have the best one of all, you don't want second best. So I've been a loner ever since he left. And I had to understand what caused my community to go nuts. So that led me to explore our history. And one of the questions was, why did the Longhouse, the traditional people, split down the middle too? Why were there two factions that couldn't see eye to eye? Why were they violent to each other? Had to know that. So that launched me onto this 30-year adventure of history. And I also noticed as I began to research that there was also a movement to recast our history, a revisionist history movement. And it was more rhetorical than actual empirical history research. It was more about emotion and anger and outrage. And it was a reaction to decades and decades of the so-called white man out there telling us about what wild savages we were. So the reaction was to counter that with a new narrative that says, oh, no, we actually were a benefit to all society. We introduced democratic forms of government and certain food crops. And so there's a whole litany of things that the traditional revival promotes. And some of that veers into kind of revisionist history. And I got kind of swept up into that also, mostly because in my community, we had a court case where a false history was presented in Canadian court. And it didn't go unnoticed, and it got demolished by the Crown's lawyers and expert witnesses. I saw that. I witnessed that happening. And so I said, somebody from our camp has to play the devil's advocate and go into the archives and read everything you can about what's in there about us. We don't want to go to court again and have a chief on the stand get mocked and belittled by a Crown lawyer. We got to know what the Crown's expert witnesses are finding and what they're writing, and we need to know the literature. We need to study it, and we need to reevaluate our narrative about history so that it holds water, so that we don't just go in there with some airy-fairy story and then get blitzed by some hotshot Crown witness, because that happens. So I also was an employee of our band council and our tribal councils. We have two elected governments in Akwesasne. Because we have a border going through our community, we have two elected councils. So I've worked for both of them on and off. I was even an elected chief for one term on the Canadian side more than 20 years ago. And so I became that guy who wanted to see I love that word, an empirical history of our people. Because as I'm studying the literature, going to archives, not as much as I wish I did, but and studying the writings of other historians, critically, of course, it led me to the subject of my talk today. Wow, what a long, meandering introduction to it, wasn't that? That was awful. I'm like Trump after all. Anyway, so here's how I start off. You've all seen that painting before, right? Just give me a little nod of the head if you've seen that painting before. I stole that from the Yale University Art Gallery yesterday. There's a big reward. I suggest you cash it in. Get rich off my misery. That is the death of General Montgomery at the Battle of Quebec, more or less. And the painting was by Jonathan Trumbull, or is it John Trumbull? He had a son. I get them mixed up. But he was an aide-de-camp of General George Washington, served with him, and was also quite an artist. And you might have also heard of Guy West. He was another artist that did these kind of epic colonial paintings. So this one was done about the Battle of Quebec when the Americans invaded Canada at the beginning of the war. What, you never heard of that? Did that page fall out of your history books? Because they got the stuffing kicked out of them when they got there. And guess who did it? My people did. When the Americans invaded the Montreal area, the British came and knocked on our door at Akwesasne and Ganawage and the other native mission communities and said, hey, remember when at the end of the 7 Years' War, when the British Army was bearing down on you, and you feebly came to us and said, hey, well, how about a treaty? And we said, yes. Remember that when you agreed that we wouldn't wipe you out as long as you become peaceful? Well, now you're part of our alliance. We're now under attack and a threat, and we need you to accept the call to war. And so we had to go. 100 of my Akwesasne ancestors heard that call and accepted that call and went to drive out the Americans from the Montreal area. It was called the Battle of the Cedars. And there's a big book about it, too, fairly recent book called On the Warpath to the Cedars. So look that one up. A good friend of mine wrote that. So most of the native people in the St. Lawrence Valley rallied to the British cause, but there was a small holdout of people who supported the American cause. And there you see the leader of them holding the tomahawk in the background of that painting. So there's General Montgomery. He's taken a bullet. He's dying. All of his officers are absolutely devastated that in this pitched battle, their leader has just taken a hit. He's going to die. But there's a warrior in the background right near the officers with his tomahawk raised, and he's determined to keep fighting even though the general's down. Because, well, native people had what's called a parallel track of war. It wasn't quite the same motivation as our British or American or French or whatever, as our allies. They had another agenda. Ours was slightly different through all the wars. So Lewis Cook was there, leading the people. Keep going, come on, guys. The only problem is that, in a very technical sense, he wasn't really at that battle. He was somewhere else. He was actually heading to New England with other native leaders to continue to urge the Americans on. It's kind of like that. Thematically, he's urging them on. But he's going somewhere else. He's not present when that attack on Quebec City occurred and General Montgomery died. So a lot of these paintings, they throw people in, mostly just because it's like an honorary thing. Like, for instance, in the death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West, there's people in there that were not really present at that battle. So I guess that's the same thing here. Did the painter know Colonel Lewis Cook? He was an aide-de-camp to General Washington for a brief time. And Colonel Lewis Cook, the name of the person in that, the native holding the tomahawk, actually met George Washington a couple of times and was known. So did the artist see him in person? Did he base that on reality? That's still we haven't been able to get those answers yet. He actually had the name a little bit wrong. He thought it was named in the notes for the painting. He calls him an Oneida chief, and that's a mistake. Although he led Oneida warriors in the war, he wasn't actually an Oneida. He was, well, let me get into it. Let's go. Let's talk about Colonel Lewis Cook. Now, a little bit north of here, you all are aware of old Schuylerville. Used to be a location of old Saratoga. In 1745, the Kahnawake Mohawks from Canada, my people, came down the Lake Champlain, I guess you would say came up the Lake Champlain corridor, and with the French forces to attack easy targets in the Hudson Valley. And the easy target was Fort Saratoga. Saratoga's fort was somewhat run down in 1745. In fact, the governor had withdrawn the troops. So, and most of the people who lived in Saratoga had actually gone to their summer homes in Albany or wherever. So the settlement itself didn't have a big population. So when the French and their native allies swooped in, I think it was October or November of 1745, they were pretty, they easily captured and burned to the ground the entire settlement. The fort, it went up like matchbox sticks. It was pretty quick for them to win. Now, there's an account of that battle written by the commander that ended up in British hands, and it's in the New York Public Library in the Schuyler papers. The head person of that village was Philip Schuyler, not the Rev War general, but his uncle, and he was killed. He died in that attack. He had fought back, and they burned his house down after shooting him. And another horrible thing that happened in that attack was those that stayed inside their homes and would, try to use it as like a little fort, they were all burned in their houses. And the rest were all taken captive and shipped off to Canada. They later rebuilt the fort, but I'm not going to talk about what happened to the fort later. We're going to follow one of the captives. There's a story about Lewis Cook that he was half Abenaki. His mom was an Abenaki Indian, and his father was an African slave. And there's an oral tradition that was recorded about Lewis being captured because he looked more African than native. One of the soldiers grabbed him and pulled him to the slaves that they were claiming. And the natives saw the woman cry out, the mother of the child cry out, that's my boy, that's my boy. And so they intervened and said, no, he's coming with the mother and she's coming with us. So that's the oral tradition. And so he ends up getting adopted, and he and his mother become part of the Kahnawake community. And he is raised as he's adopted, given a new Indian name, Akiatonharónkwen, and grows up, because he's only about 5, 6, or 7 years old at this time. But by the time the 7 Years' War breaks out, he's a teenager, young adult, goes to war on the side of the French, ends up, apparently was at the defeat of General Braddock on the Monongahela in the Ohio River Valley, 1755, I think. Yeah. And was also active on the Lake Champlain, Lake George frontier, was injured, and later ended up becoming an American officer in the Continental Army for the American Revolution. Going against the grain, as I said earlier, the bulk of his community were pro-British. They were all allies of the British Empire as of 1760 and onward. So for some reason, though, fighting the English throughout the war, all those years, he couldn't fathom becoming an ally. So as soon as he heard that the colonies were thinking about rebelling, he was like, oh, this sounds good, I'm in. Whatever, if they're throwing King George out of town, I'm in. So he kind of went against the grain of his community and actually went and was part of the invasion of the Montreal area. In fact, when the American troops who invaded Montreal at the beginning, before the Declaration of Independence had even been signed, the Americans had invaded the Montreal area. And so when they were defeated and driven out, when the American troops embarked in their little boats and whaleboats to get out of there, Lewis Cook stayed on the shore scowling at them. He thought they were cowards. And so even though he was kind of like one of the few natives who supported the Americans coming in like this, it looked like he was going to keep the fight going. So he kicked the boat off and watched them depart. But then he later ends up going down to Albany and New York City and anywhere that he could find an American officer to say, hey, you have some friends in Canada who support this, and I'm their leader. I have 500 warriors at my beck and call that will be at your service. All you need to do is make me an officer in your army, and they're yours. I think he kind of exaggerated his numbers. He really only had a handful of guys. Yeah, there were 500 warriors, but they were all ardently pro-British by this point already. But it was a good story to tell. Anyway, he met General Philip Schuyler, the famous one that we had a statue of here in town. I love that statue, by the way. Very impressive. He met him and then was introduced to General George Washington. It's in his writings. General Washington acknowledges, yes, I've had a visit by Colonel Lewis. And this is before he was even given a commission, that he already had the nickname Colonel Lewis. That was the thing about warriors in Indian country, is that you got nicknamed Lieutenant Nicholas or Captain Johnny or something like that. That just became your kind of Indian warrior nickname. So they were already calling Colonel Lewis at the beginning of the war. So Schuyler writes to Washington and says, what do we do about this offer? He said, we don't really have the money to outfit a whole 500 warriors from Canada, but if we don't, well, surely the British are, and so we've got to seriously think about what we're going to do. So the compromise was, well, it doesn't cost us too much to make one guy an officer and see if he can, kind of roll with that. That's not George Washington's actual words, by the way. So they agree, we're gonna recruit Colonel Lewis at least and see if he can just kind of like grandfather in all the other warriors as we go. So Colonel Lewis, though, knows that they're already pro-British in Canada, and his thing was kind of a ruse. So he ends up among the Oneidas, the Oneida Indians, because the Mohawks of the Mohawk River Valley were so pro-British that there was no question they were not going to join any American units. They're not going to support that. Mostly because of the power and influence of Sir William Johnson and his family. He had died just before the conflict in 1774, but his wife Molly, his housekeeper Molly, I should say, and her brother Joseph, as well as many of their family and friends and relatives in the Mohawk Valley, were leaning toward the British cause because that had been their bread and butter for decades. So, of course, they're going to want to go with the British. Joseph Brant, being a young man at that time, actually went to England and ends up with a captain's commission and many paintings of him. He was a little bit on the vain side, But he was a handsome, good-looking guy, and so who can blame him, right? So might as well get your portrait done. There's a portrait of Joseph Brant at his prime, 1776, when the war's just beginning, in the National Gallery in Ottawa. And if you ever happen to visit the National Gallery of Ottawa, you'll be just trucking through the exhibits, and all of a sudden you'll look, and there's an Indian warrior in a hole in the wall staring right at you. Well, it's not a hole in the wall. It's actually a painting on the wall of Joseph Brant. But it's just so vivid and so well painted and photorealistic. And the face of Joseph Brant looks so familiar to people like me because I've seen guys like him all my life. He has a very recognizable Mohawk face. And when you see him in that painting, and it just jumps right out at you, it's really an impressive thing to see that painting. It's a very famous painting. It's in all the books. So most of you probably know which painting I'm talking about. But he's a stud. He's a good-looking guy. But he looks like he would rip your head right off. He's tough. So, yeah, he got many portraits over the years. And so by the time he's an old guy, he's still getting his portrait done. But he's a little bit heavier, a little bit worn out by then, but still you can tell that this is not a guy you want to mess with. That painting of Colonel Lewis Cook, on the other hand, we don't know if that's what he looked like. That guy looks more native than African, which his biographer says he looked more African. He had curly hair. He was very dark, very quiet, very athletic looking. And so there was a painting done of him later in life, around when he was in his 70s. But we don't know what happened to that. It was painted by a friend that he knew, and then later the painting was given to one of his servants, and it disappeared. We don't know. It may turn up someday in some auction or Antiques Road show. If you ever see it, call me right away, okay? Just a very dignified African native looking guy. Probably might have a earring stretched, his earlobe stretched out. I don't know, but keep an eye out for it. It might turn up someday. So we don't really know. And he also understood that a lot of natives look down their nose on those that hold themselves out. He had actually turned down a gift of a medal from a French officer because he didn't want his fellow warriors to think he was in it for that he was in it for the cause. He didn't care about all the glamour of it. So, yeah, interesting guy to be so caught up in the cause of it all. And he used to give big speeches. He even recruited not just natives to fight for the Americans, but actual settlers heard him speak and said, hey, I think I'm going to join up. So he gets mentioned here and there. And now there's no mention of him by name in the earlier war, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. There's no mention of him by name. But that, when you're just a regular common Joe warrior, you don't get mentioned. It's usually the chiefs. But by this time, he's in his 30s. He's of the age where he's a respected leader of war parties. He's a fighter, and his name gets written down, and he gets mentioned. And so the commission eventually, I think it's about 1779, his commission finally goes through, along with some for the Oneidas and a Tuscarora. They get their commissions. There's lieutenants and captains that are given. But Lewis Cook is given a lieutenant colonel commission. And as far as I know, and as far as all the other historians of the war have been able to determine, that's the highest ranked non-European person in the Continental Army for that conflict. So I take a lot of pride in that. And, in the history world, you go to history events and festivals, there's always this old guy who comes up, right? Comes up to your table, and he's always bragging about his ancestor who fought in this and such a battle, and he's going to tell you all about this guy because he's researched the heck out of him, right? There, yep. We get that all the time. There's tons of guys like that all the time. They never tell you about all their ancestors that stayed home from that manly man stuff, right? No, it's only the one that went. Well, unfortunately, I'm one of those guys too. Because that guy's my ancestor. I'm the 7th generation from him. On my mom's side of the family, my grandfather's mother descends from Colonel Lewis Cook. And yes, I've done the research. I can back it up. I don't have it on me, of course, but I can back it up. So yeah, we're 7th generation. And when I was a kid, my mother actually told us, she says, don't ever make any jokes about black people. This is in the 70s. And we said, why? And she said, because we have an ancestor named Captain Cook. And he was black. And so that always stuck in my mind as a little kid, that to be very mindful about that. And she told us, not just because your ancestor is African, because it's wrong to make fun of people of other cultures. She taught us that too. But she did mention that. Now, she got the ranking wrong. He was a lieutenant colonel. So, but in my mind, I conjured up a pirate, sailing back and forth on the St. Lawrence River in a big sailing ship with a big hat, looking like Captain Crunch. And so that was what my mind conjured up, a pirate, So, but then later I find out, no, he was actually a real commissioned officer in George Washington's army. Really did fight. He's written on the Oriskany Monument. His name is on there. So yeah, he was at the Battle of Oriskany in 1777 with the Oneida Warriors. I've seen it written there were about 30 Oneida Warriors who were accompanying the Americans who were heading up the Mohawk Valley to go to Fort Stanwix or Fort Schuyler do I got the names right of that fort? Fort Stanwix, right? Anyway, it's under British siege. They're being attacked by Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga warriors, and the British Army. The fort surrounded, so the American relief effort is heading up the river. Molly Brant hears about it, writes a letter to her brother who's at the siege with the British, warns them about this big 500-man force heading their way. They set an ambush, and the American forces walk right into it. It's bloody carnage. One of the participants, Seneca warrior named Black Snake, says the blood was just flowing like a river from the battlefield. It was so bad. And so Lewis Cook was there. One day, when I was starting out as a history guy in the 90s, I'm driving down through the next town over, Messina, New York. A voice in my head says, stop at the library, because I'm right near the library. Go in. Yeah, crazy guy hearing voices, right? So I look at the library. I'd never been in there. I said, all right, I'll go check it out. There I am talking back to the voice, so I'm nuts. I go into the library. Hey, where's your history section? He said, back there with all the cobwebs. So, okay, I'll go back there. I'm just looking around at books. I find a book called Fort Stanwix and Oriskany. I pull it out. I open up to a page. There's a paragraph, a quote, that talks about a warrior at the Battle of Oriskany. A brave and daring hunter named Lewis, it says, who was watching his men get shot by a sniper from the enemy side. And he's scowling at this because he keeps hitting his comrades. Finally, one of the other combatants says, Lewis, what's wrong? And he says, over there is a serpent. Every time he rises up, he shoots and kills one of our men. He says, I can take it no more. Either he or I will die today. And so he waits until he fires that musket. And you have a few seconds to reload that, so he has his chance. So he runs over, jumps over the tree that this guy was hiding behind, takes him out with his tomahawk and scalps him, and runs back to his friends and throws the scalp on the ground and says, he won't bother us anymore. And so this little quote, it was found by a Mohawk Valley historian. He heard this anecdote wrote it down in one of his books. It got repeated by a few other people. I had no idea about it. I didn't know anything about this quote. It was the first time I ever read this. But that was, I swear to God, that was why that weird voice in my head said, stop. So who was it? Was it actually Colonel Lewis telling me, oh yeah, there's a book about me in that library. Go and check it out. Not that I'm an egotistical guy or anything, but I don't know how the spirit world works. Do they know what books are in libraries? I don't know. I'm a believer in that stuff too. I'm actually the most haunted person you'll ever meet, man. But when it comes to history, man, I'm a by the book kind of history guy. I don't mess around. I don't tolerate any funny business. I don't like people lying about oral history. I like to see the real stuff. And I'm going to swear to that till the day I die. I just wish those ghosts would stop bothering me and picking on me all the time. Because I want my stuff to be dry, boring, empirical history. So that's what served me all along. And that's what led me to all kinds of weird discoveries. Here's another discovery that just happened to fall into my lap. A friend of mine invited me to go to the McCord Museum in Montreal, where some of these wampum belt replicas, the originals, are there. So we knew that. So we wanted to go see those belts. So when I get there, I meet the curator. Her name was Mrs. McCaffrey. And so we're talking about the belts, and she gets to show me the belts in the vault and everything. It's really cool. So she asked me about my research interests, and I mentioned Colonel Lewis Cook's name. And she says, oh, I just happened to get a letter from somebody who mentioned that guy. And I'm like, what? That's odd. And so she says, yes, I'll mail that to you. So it comes in the mail. It's a description of it's a journal entry from a French officer who came to North America along with all of the other French officers who came to help the American cause. And this guy, his name was Stephen de Ponceau. He was a lawyer, and he was attached to General Steuben, who came to train our troops. And he describes how he was walking through the woods at Valley Forge in April of 1778, and happens to hear a voice singing in French in the woods. And so he walks slowly upon this person, and it's an Indian dressed in a full officer's regimental uniform, belting out a French opera song in the morning in the woods. Because that happens. And so he approaches him and says, when he's done singing, he says to him basically, oh, you have a beautiful voice. Please tell me who you are. And so he ends up in a conversation with this gentleman, and this gentleman reveals in French, because he's fluent in French, that he is called Colonel Lewis, and that it was a name given to him at baptism, that he's a good Catholic, and that he supports the American cause. And he's concerned, he goes, tell me, my father, how is the king doing? The French king. And so this young officer says, well, I'm too young for you to call me father. I'm a young man. And he says, oh, we call all the French our father. The British wanted us to call them our father, but no, we're loyal to our French father, the king. So this is Colonel Lewis. It's so obvious. And so he says, oh, I went and had breakfast with him and the other officers, and he told me more stories, but I never saw him again. I don't know what became of this man. But that little anecdote he wrote down in his journals and his recollections years and years later, got published, got tucked away in some Pennsylvania history journal that I never would have read had not some scholar contacted Mrs. McCaffrey at the McCord Museum, and then she just happened to hook me up with that. So there's just been all of these odd little curiosities that have happened throughout my time. Here's another one, a very local one. I was in this here building because, here's what happened. I was working for our band council on land claims, and we have an American land claim that relates to a treaty that Colonel Lewis Cook signed. So that was when I kind of decided I need to go to Albany and see what's in the archives, see what's in the New York State Library. A biography of Colonel Lewis Cook was written by somebody who knew him personally and had been shared with New York historian Franklin Huff in 1852. Franklin Huff paraphrased from it and published a history of St. Lawrence and Franklin counties in 1853, which has a chapter about my community in there, and also a brief biography of Colonel Lewis Cook. Now, here's why I was at the New York State Library, is because the biography is here in the New York State Library in the Franklin Huff papers. And so I had to see it in person. And so I came and I saw it, and I was talking to the archivist, and I mentioned the magic name, Colonel Lewis Cook. Well, a guy sitting over on a little chair perks his ears up, and he comes scooting right up to me, waits till I'm done, because he's a polite young man, and he says, "Oh, excuse me." He said, I couldn't help but hear you mention Colonel Lewis Cook. And I'm like, as far as I know, there's only 5 people that know who that is, but lay it on me. And he says, he goes, I'm a researcher. And he said, I study the Oneidas. And he goes, I know all about Colonel Lewis Cook. And he goes, and there's a guy here at the New York State Museum who is an expert on him, actually, and has a big fat file on him. And I'm like, wow. I was just floored. So he says, I'll go and introduce you. So we went trekking off to see Philip Lord. Does Phil Lord still work here? Or is he retired? Okay. Anyway, so he was here. He had a file about that thick on Colonel Lewis Cook, because he was working on a book of the waterways of New York State, and Colonel Lewis Cook features in that stuff because he lived in Oneida for a time after the war. So, yep, Philip Lord was amazing. He made a whole photocopy of that big fat file. There were things in there I had never heard or read. He had actually transcribed that biography that I was there to see. So I got to see the actual biography, take the photocopy of all this material. Almost collapsed, because how the heck does that happen? Just by chance you meet somebody that just happens to know an expert on this stuff. So I figured, man, I'm blessed. I must be blessed. Somebody wants me to find this stuff for a good reason, I'm sure. Well, we'll find out later. Anyway, so in that file that Philip Lord had, it actually had a map of an area near Oneida Lake where Colonel Lewis had a house. I didn't know that. There had actually been some archaeology done in that area, that little neighborhood. I didn't know that either, but it had the little report in there. So the next day, I jumped in the car and I drove all the way there. I had to see for myself. I had to walk the ground where this historic site was, because I did not know of it. But here I am being led to find these kind of things. So it's just been amazing to get to experience that, to feel as though there's some guiding hand leading me to all those things. Now, I got to backtrack a little bit. I mentioned this biography, right? Written by somebody who knew Colonel Lewis Cook. That author, who was a veteran of the War of 1812 himself, was from Ganawage, so he was Mohawk. Now, he also was literate. He had gone to Moore's Charity School and learned to read and write, and was a minister. So that's very rare to have somebody back then who could read and write. But we have that guy. He wrote this biography of Colonel Lewis Cook. The problem is, how do I put this? That guy was a notorious liar, a fraudster, a cheat, who claimed to, well, actually he wrote a fake war journal for the War of 1812, in which he claimed to be responsible for the victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh. No other journal or account of the war mentions this guy. He claims he was a colonel in the war. No record of that. He really was in the war. We were able to verify that, but he was certainly not the epic person that he claimed to be. In fact, his name was Reverend Eleazar Williams. Now, if you're a real history buff, that name will jump out at you. He was also one of the people who claimed to be the lost Dauphin of France, the son of King Louis and Marie Antoinette. Louis and Marie were, of course, killed in the French Revolution, and their children were imprisoned, and the heir to the French throne died in prison. But if you've ever seen the movie The Scarlet Pimpernel, there's always been legend that perhaps the heir to the throne of France was smuggled out of prison and ended up living out his life somewhere. Well, Eleazar Williams heard about this and decided that perhaps he was the lost king of France. And so that was how Eleazar Williams became super famous. In the 1850s, he was a household name. Everybody knew who he was. In fact, if you ever read Huckleberry Finn, the con men in the end of the book, one of them is supposed to be the lost Dauphin. Well, that's based on Eleazar Williams, because Mark Twain knew all about Eleazar Williams and what a fraud he was and what a charlatan. So he was already called out as a fraud while he lived. But he still persisted. And he also, this crazy coot, he had passed himself off as a chief at Akwesasne. Well, everybody did back then. That's no big deal. And he signed some treaty or agreement to kick us off our res and send us to live out west in Kansas or some godforsaken place. But we didn't go because he wasn't our chief, and he didn't have any authority to sign any such thing. So we kind of have a little bit of an animosity towards his memory. He was a missionary in our community for the Episcopalian faith, but nobody sent their kids to his school, so he had to go to the next town over, Fort Covington, try his luck there, because nobody wanted anything to do with him. And when his lie got around that he was not really the son of his mom and dad, his mother, who was still alive, was so heartbroken to hear that her own son had disavowed her and claimed to have some other mother, that she was devastated, and she even had the priest write an affidavit to state the record, to clarify that, yes, Eleazar Williams is my own flesh and blood son. I did not adopt him. He's not, the Scarlet Pimpernel didn't bring him to my doorstep. So, but he played that for all it was worth, because he was a failed missionary, and he was in his declining years, and so this was his last campaign. He went on a speaking tour, got all kinds of donations, so it was kind of his little prophet thing at the end of his life. So I look up. I published a whole book which includes that biography that he wrote. That's it on the table over there. That's my recent book. Came out in 2020. It's my COVID project. When we got shut down for COVID, I said, I'm going to use this opportunity to write a book. So that's the book that I wrote. And it includes not only what Eleazar Williams wrote about Colonel Lewis Cook, but Eleazar wrote about his own father, Thomas Williams, who fought on the British side in the American Revolution, and also the interpreter for the Indians named William Gray, who had been captured and adopted into our community. So he wrote 3 biographies. They're all in my book. They're all upstairs. Well, we may repatriate them at some point. Anyway, they're in the book. And also what Franklin Huff wrote also, because he went and scoured the archives for more. He found all the writings of Schuyler and Washington that mentioned Lewis Cook, and so he included them into his account. So that's in the book too. I also describe the meeting of Franklin B. Huff, who was only a young doctor, meeting Eleazar Williams, and he knew ahead of time that Eleazar Williams was a bit of a woo. He had already heard the story of his claims to the throne, chose to ignore it because, hey, this guy knew those people that he's writing about. So, and I believe that Eleazar Williams was mostly honest and fair about what he wrote. He literally did know Colonel Lewis Cook, so he must have had time to spend with him and get his story, because the things that he ascribes to Lewis Cook match the historical record. The earlier stuff about the 7 Years' War, it's dubious because there's no actual mention in French or British sources of Colonel Lewis Cook by name. But the battles that he describes, they do kind of suggest it might have happened. So I'm currently writing a new book about Colonel Lewis Cook, a full biography that takes in not only what Eleazar Williams wrote, Franklin Huff wrote, but what scholars since then have found about Colonel Lewis Cook, because they have found a fortune of material. Men like Philip Lord, Barbara Graymont, a whole bunch of other scholars. Some of the more recent ones, Colin Calloway is one that comes to mind. There's a guy named Martin who wrote a book about the Oneidas in the war. I just can't remember his full name. But Lewis Cook is starting to have his day in the sun. Scholars are encountering him. They contact me many times because I have a website where I have all the Eleazar Williams material up there. So they contact me. So I'm constantly hearing from new scholars that have found other descriptions of Lewis Cook. For instance, when the French arrived in Rhode Island, Lewis Cook and many Oneida warriors were there to greet him. And so we have little French references about Colonel Lewis Cook. Scott Stevenson, the director of the National Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, he's a good friend of mine. He sends me stuff. He sent me one. He goes, hey, I found a thing about Colonel Lewis where he's accompanying General Washington as they review the troops somewhere down in the southern states, where they're riding on horseback, and some of the officers are aghast that General Washington has all these native warriors with him, and they're all painted with war paint, and they're quite ferocious looking. So it was quite shocking to see the commander-in-chief with an accompanying retinue of warriors, all arrayed in their finery. Other sources that have popped up, I can't remember which of the founding fathers mentions going to a dinner with a bunch of warriors, some who speak French, so I'm thinking Colonel Lewis is there. But this founding father mentions, he says, oh, they were quite, they had good manners, and they were very, surprising, I guess, to him. But then when he says when it was time for dinner, they just tore into the food like wild barbarians, he says. We still do that to this day, yeah, I'm afraid, I'm sorry. Hey, what are you going to do? So all these things have been coming to me, and I've been determined to pull them all together. So now I'm in the midst of it, and I'm hoping by the end of the winter I'll have a new book out, and that's my retirement policy, actually. Poor planning throughout my career. That I've got to have a bestseller in my hands by the time I hit 65, or I'm in big trouble. So that's my next big project is to really encompass all of the research that's happened since then, to bring it all into one book, and to get it out there so that people really, because we're heading into the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. I remember the 200th, that should give my age away. When we did the bicentennial, I remember that. And it runs the risk of falling into that tricorn hats and white powdered wigs and big cufflinks. It runs into just being kind of like a celebration of Yankee Doodle Dandy again. So fortunately, a lot of the people at the various museums recognize that they don't want it to be that. So they're encouraging partnerships with Native communities to bring forward our stories about the war and the warriors, what we can remember of it anyway, any oral traditions that may still exist. And there are some. In fact, good old Colonel Lewis. I mentioned my Uncle Irving, the Navy veteran. His mom was a wonderful language teacher named Ruth, and she had been a cook. Her maiden name was Cook. So I had a elders interview project in the 90s when she was still with us. And so she was one of the oldest in the community, so I went to see her. And she mentioned a story about Colonel Lewis Cook. She says, when I was a little kid, my father was an iron worker, and he worked all over the States. And he lived in Newburgh for a while. And so we were visiting him, and he said, I need to take you to see some of the sites. So that Newburgh was where Washington had his headquarters for a while. And so he took Ruth to see a painting. That's what she said, it was a painting. And he pointed to somebody in the painting and said, that's our ancestor. That's Colonel Lewis Cook. We're descended from him. And he fought in the war, and he was at this battle. Well, he was wrong, but that's okay. And so she remembered that. She didn't remember what painting, but she remembers, seeing it as a child and having her father point out Colonel Lewis Cook. So I asked Ruth, I said, what did they say about him? She said, well, he was very quiet, and he would sit in his chair near the window and just smoke his pipe or look out the window, and didn't say very much, but every now and then a message would come for him, and he would just pack his things and leave. They never knew where he went, but he would come back months later. And it was probably because he was off on some war or some battle or some diplomatic mission or signing a treaty or who knows what it could have been. But he didn't tell any of the family what it was, where he was going, when he'd be back. But then he would show up again and sit back in his chair and wait for another messenger to show up. Until finally one day he left and didn't come back. So that's the oral tradition that I got from Ruth. That was wonderful, because that accords with what we know of Colonel Lewis Cook. Another biographer says he was quiet. He only spoke when it was really super important, and that he smoked. Everybody smoked back then. So, but him going on these long journeys and long adventures and disappearing. There's another anecdote that when he went off to the War of 1812 in his 70s, he was his officer's commission was upgraded to general, because there's even a newspaper in Plattsburgh that calls him General Lewis is here in town. And so what we believe is that it was an honorary generalship given to him. And also it is said that he was given a full uniform at that time to correspond with the rank. So a brigadier general uniform for the War of 1812 had one of those great big flat black hats that looks ridiculous, kind of like an easy target, if you might say so. But so he comes back, and the story is that when he reappeared in his uniform, all the children were just terrified that they thought he was some kind of monster and wouldn't go near him. So these are the cool little anecdotes that float around about Lewis Cook. And so, so he's fought in the War of 18... before I get into the War of 1812, I want to talk about the controversy. Now, in the 1790s, Lewis Cook was asked by the council at Kahnawake if he would go to meet with the Americans about their lands, because they had heard people were settling on their lands and they wanted some justice. So they knew Lewis Cook had been an officer and knew a lot of very influential people. So they said, well, maybe he should be the one to go with our delegates. So they had some chiefs from Kahnawake and William Gray, who had been captured and adopted and became one of our interpreters. He accompanied these delegates. They came to Albany, they came to Lake George, and to New York City over a span of 3 or 4 years, negotiating with New York State, actually. And there was an American commissioner present also. So eventually they settled on a treaty in which the chiefs who were present relinquished our claims to lands in New York State for a reserve, which roughly corresponds to the reserve we have today, with some additional properties added to it. So they signed a treaty and went home, and then everything blew up. There was a faction that wasn't aware of these negotiations, because back then, in the 1790s, there was a big war brewing in the Great Lakes area, and it was dragging the United States and the British dangerously close to another war. So people were very quiet about their negotiations. So Kahnawake chiefs, being in Canada, the British territory, going and negotiating in Albany with Americans, keep that quiet. So some people in our communities weren't even aware that this was going on. So this controversy about this treaty, which began at the time it was signed, has continued on into the modern era. So we currently have a land claim based on that treaty and the lands that were added to it, which were later sold. So the basis of our treaty is the Federal Non-Intercourse Act, which forbids the states and private interests from buying Indian land. You need to have a federal commissioner present. So that treaty in 1796 did have a federal commissioner. It's the law of the land. It's a fully recognized, authorized treaty. But because it's Colonel Lewis Cook, opponents of our land claim settlement have zeroed in on his heritage, the fact that he's Abenaki, an African in his origin story. To them, precludes him from having any kind of authority to negotiate any kind of treaty. But they ignore the fact that adoption is a big part of our culture, and it doesn't matter who your ancestors were if you're adopted and become one of us. You're one of us, period. Never talk about it again. So he was adopted and given a Mohawk name. He's part of us. So, but they're cherry picking evidence. They're ignoring the actual archival heritage of Lewis Cook. They're just picking out little I gotcha kind of things. So the leading proponent of this anti-Colonel Lewis Cook hysteria is probably one of the most famous contemporary Mohawks today, a man named Doug George Gunandillo. I kind of hate to say his name out loud, but I did. I just did. Anyway, I actually know this guy personally. He hired me to work at the newspaper in Akwesasne in the late 80s. So I've known him a long time. And when the land claim began in the early 1980s, he began writing negatively about it and zeroing in on Colonel Lewis Cook. And there was another scholar before him by the name of David Blanchard, who was a Carmelite friar who was working on his PhD thesis, and he lived in Ganawage for a time and kind of got the militant bug from some of the people that he used to hang around with. And their perspective was that all of those treaties that Colonel Lewis Cook signed, that Joseph Brant signed, all of those are frauds. That's not true, but that's the take that they've taken on them. So David Blanchard took it upon himself to write a history of Ganawage in which he promoted that false accusation against those people that signed the treaties. So Doug George read that stuff, took it on his own, and said, I'm going to go with this. I'm going to make this my cause, that I'm going to debunk and defraud and just terrorize the memory of Colonel Lewis Cook. So knowing full well what he was up to, I decided, well, I can't let that stand. I have to, I've actually read this stuff. I've done the homework. I've put the time into this. I need to defend the honor of my own ancestor right there. I need to, really research what it was. He was fully authorized to go and negotiate. He had Ganawage chiefs with him. The lie is that it was a private secret deal and no real chiefs had any involvement. And we know this because one of the people who signed was a Ganawage chief named Onawio, who we know as having the name Paul Goodstream, and he was actually had the last name of Bova. So we know that he was a real chief in Ganawage. After that treaty was signed in 1796, he and another delegation of chiefs went to Vermont to do the same thing because we had claims to land in Vermont as well. So we know this. It's in the Vermont public record of having native delegations from Ganawage come to pursue a land claim for their hunting grounds in Vermont. Didn't get anywhere. They had to keep going back generation after generation, and only to be rebuffed. They were going as late as the 1950s. People were talking about going after that land. But Paul Goodstream, Onawio, Bova was part of that delegation with Colonel Lewis Cook. So yeah, it was a legitimate political attempt by the communities to get some justice for their land. One of the curious things about it, which I uncovered, was the fact that right before they signed the treaty, the American commissioner, the federal American commissioner who had to be present, said, I'm all in favor of everybody signing this thing, but I'm going to need you native delegates to go home and get ratification once it's signed. Go to all the 7 Nations of Canada communities and have them sign off on it, bring it back, and it'll be good as gold. Well, they didn't do that. For some reason, they forgot about it. So, but it didn't matter. He's like, who cares? We'll submit it. So they submitted the treaty to George Washington. He submitted it to Congress. It was fully authorized. It's legit. It's in all of the treaty books. It's for real. So those people that are claiming it was a fraud, that it wasn't legitimate, didn't have all the right chiefs or whatever, it's nonsense. So we have a settlement process going on in Akwesasne. We have the 2 elected councils, my employers, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, the Canadian side that I used to be a chief on, the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs, the Longhouse, the chiefs of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, have been parties to this land claim settlement since the beginning, since 1982. So we're now in the settlement phase. We had a possible settlement in 2004, 2005. It tanked out, but we're back at it again. It's just that those opponents, Doug George, Gunandio, and I would say maybe about 50 people have kind of made that their thing, is that they want to oppose this land claim settlement. Even though we've had votes on it in the past, people have approved it. They have convinced themselves that this is the indigenous thing to do, is to oppose this. I'm dead set against. I'm absolutely in favor of settling this land claim. A, I used to work on the land claim. I was a land claims researcher. B, I was an elected Mohawk Council of Akwesasne Chiefs. I used to sign the bill for the lawyers that were working on this claim. I came to Albany to meet with the governor's office with the delegates at one point. So yeah, I've been in on it. I'm not about to all these years later suddenly jump up saying, oh, we got to oppose this thing. Oh, no, absolutely not. We need to bring it home, get it done, get this thing finalized, and I'll tell you why. It's because in some of the land that we're claiming that was sold illegally, people have bought property. Our own people from Akwesasne have bought properties in these land claim areas, and some of them stopped paying taxes on them, figuring it was going to come back to the res at some point. So they've been foreclosed. Their lands are just about to go up for auction, and they've got houses on them that they're going to lose. So through their own wisdom, they embarked on that course of action. And so if this land claim settlement gets wiped out and we're back to square one, that's it. It's over. There's no going to court. It's done. That'll just die a slow death. So we have that thing hanging over us that we're so close to having it across the finish line, but there's still that very vocal, but minority opposition to it. So they'll go and rant and rave and hoot and holler and protest at the courthouse in Syracuse, the federal courthouse. And they can be very passionate about their objections. And when you listen to it, if you don't know better, you can become convinced that they must be right. They must be telling the truth. But having done the homework, having read every aspect of the court case, every aspect of the history behind the treaty, knowing Colonel Lewis Cook's life, as I do, I have to stand in support of that, the whole process, because I've been involved in it for so long. I just can't. So I have attempted to debunk Mr. Gunandillo. It was back when I was on Facebook a year ago that I challenged him and I demanded to see what evidence. You know, you're making some pretty horrific accusations against an ancestor. You better have some pretty good paperwork to back it up. He doesn't have a shred of paperwork. He hasn't done a minute of research in the 40 years that he's been ranting about this. And so I've challenged him. I said, you and I should do a debate, a public debate with an audience and everything, where we hash this out. I'll bring all my evidence and all my documents, and you bring whatever it is you got, and we'll have it out. And he refused. He wouldn't. Instead, he took to calling me an apologist. And so I'm accused of not only being an apologist for Colonel Lewis Cook, but also for Joseph Brant, because he signed another big treaty around the same time as Lewis Cook. And those two guys hated each other and accused each other of doing all the things that they themselves did. But that's a whole other lecture, which I'll be back to give sometime in the future. But so, yeah, I've really been around the block on this one. And I'm hoping that very soon we'll have that moment where the judge, the federal judge overseeing this, says, okay, enough time has passed. The process you've all engaged in of getting this approved by your communities is done. We're happy with it. Actually, all the opponents of the court case, the counties, the towns, New York State, they're all in favor of settling this. Everybody. It's just we have these people in our community that are not really represented at the table, so they're making quite a bit of hay about that. So that's how sometimes this kind of history stuff does come back to bite us in the modern time. So that's really why I've embarked on writing that next big book. Not just so that I'm not living in poverty when my job runs out, but that so that my own people can have the accurate accounting of what happened on their behalf 200 plus years ago, and they can stop demonizing their own ancestors, because who does that? Nobody does that. Nobody should ever say anything bad about the ancestors or the people that fought and died for our behalf. We're here because of people like that. Whatever decisions they made, right or wrong, they made them. They live with them. We're here because of that. Whatever decisions they made as they navigated through the colonial maelstrom, it paid off because we're alive today. Our communities still exist, and we're recovering our history, our culture, and our oral traditions, and all of the things that made us what we were. We're reviving and recovering and bringing that forward. So all of that, Colonel Lewis Cook too, we should have respect for his, yes, he was a partisan. Yes, he kind of fibbed a little bit to make things happen. But the passion and the fire in his belly that drove him, we could all use a little bit of that. We could all use some admiration of the skills that he had. He spoke 5 different languages. He spoke English, French, at least 3 different native dialects, Abenaki, Mohawk, probably Oneida, maybe even Onondaga. He lived through 4 wars. He experienced King George's War, saw horrible things happen in the burning of Fort Saratoga in 1745. He was just a little kid. 7 Years' War. He was a teenager, young adult, fighting in one of the bloodiest conflicts you've ever heard of. The American Revolution. He was in his 30s, probably getting towards 40 when he was in that. Into the treaty period, when he was in his 50s, traveling great distances to bring peace and stability to our communities after the wars. And then the War of 1812, when he's called back to defend the American cause and rallies and goes. Guy in his 70s, out there in the Niagara frontier. He was at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. The oral tradition is that he fell off his horse. How the heck he got his horse across the Niagara River, I don't know, but it is said he had a fall from a horse, succumbed to his injuries, but not before giving a speech to urge people to, be loyal and strong in their cause, and died in October of 1814. That was also written in the biography about him by Franklin Huff and Eleazar Williams. And also, it is mentioned in a petition by his community later. They said, yes, Colonel Lewis Cook, we need the New York State to recognize a new chief because our previous chief has died. And they mentioned the fact that it was October of 1814. So yeah, quite an epic life. And, send your kids off to watch Harry Potter and Marvel and The Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff. But we had an epic story that happened in our own backyard here in New York State. And a lot of that stuff is yet to come forward. It's a very exciting past. And like when we all go and have our vacations at Lake George and, are out there buying ice cream and taking our kids on little canoe trips and stuff, remember what it was like just a few centuries ago. These same wonderful places that we live and vacation in New York State were battlegrounds, and horrific things happen in those battles. Horrific. And I know they're horrific because I'm putting them in my next book. I'm quoting like crazy, and I love it. So I don't think there might be a little age warning thing on the cover of my book. Maybe not. Maybe I should do a children's version of the book too. Excise all the crazy stuff, because it is. There were some pretty horrific, brutal, violent things that happened. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. War is hell, and I'm sure not going to diminish that aspect of war. I'm not going to be the guy doing Yankee Doodle Dandy down Main Street. I'm going to be the guy giving the lecture that talks about the native price that we paid in those wars. And people ask me about that. Shouldn't we have stayed out of those wars? Wasn't that a big mistake on our ancestors' part, that they got caught up in all of those wars? And you have to say, well, yes, of course it was a mistake, but at the time, they had no choice. You either had to be on one side or the other, because even being neutral was a threat to you, because the two competing armies don't respect your neutrality. They thought you were just about one day away from joining the enemy. Both of them looked at us that way. So those little pockets of pro-British, pro-American, I call those our embassies. You needed that. You had to have that. You had to have at least one pro-British or pro-American or pro-French faction, because what if one side gets the best of the other and wins the day? Well, at least you have a Colonel Lewis Cook who can go and negotiate peace on your behalf. Or you have a Captain Joseph Brant. If the British win, he can go and talk peace on your behalf. So it makes sense to have little factions of pro-British, pro-French, pro-American, whatever, in your communities. It's not a detriment. It's actually a safeguard. So that's what I tell people when they say, shouldn't we have stayed out of it? Yeah, but you had to have some kind of card in the game, because you don't know how it's going to go. And getting involved in those wars, especially the American Revolution, is the reason we're all in Canada today. Well, most of us hightailed it for Canada. That's why there's no Mohawks in the Mohawk Valley. They all went to Tainanaga and the Grand River community. And so that's where they are today. And most of my people had left in the previous century, so we're all up in Canada now. But anyway, so I'm getting to the end. I just want to briefly talk about some of the belts. They're all related to the 7 nations of Canada, and that's basically the fancy name for the mission communities where I'm from, up and down the St. Lawrence. It's a name you don't hear too much of anymore, because we're all kind of gravitated back to the original Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Nobody really has a cause to bring up old 7 Nations stuff, because that was really a French, the French regime, that was kind of what that was tied to. So we're not in those era anymore, so the 7 Nations concept has faded away, but the belts still exist. That first one with the hexagons and diamonds and the house shapes with the crosses in them is a belt that's in the Museum of Natural History in New York City, I believe. The next one, the one with the figure with the cross coming out of his head, is a repatriated belt. It used to be here at the New York State Museum. It's been repatriated to the Confederacy. The next one is a mission belt. It's in the McCord Museum in Montreal to this day, probably gathered from one of the mission communities there. The next big one, the huge belt, is the largest known belt still existing today. The original was made by the Gunisitage or Oka community, another Mohawk community on the Ottawa River. It was also part of the 7 Nations, and they made that huge, gigantic belt Still exists, still in the McCord. The next belt was given to the Kahnawake Mohawks by the Hurons of Wendouree. They lived together in the same village for a time, but then they moved to Quebec City. So they gave that next big belt to Kahnawake to keep them firm in their faith and to urge them to guard against the demons that try to destroy all the good things we create. The next belt, the one with the little checkerboard figures, is a Seven Nations belt. Those are actually, the purple in the middle of those emblems is a turtle. That's my theory, by the way. I have to point it out. This is the shell. This is his head. That's his front legs and his hind legs and his tail. And there's a cross on his shell because he's a Catholic turtle. So that is my theory on it, because it's not written in the museum collection. It's just something I looked at and I said, what the heck does that symbol mean? What is it? What is that supposed to be? Did they go to the Daytona 500 and that's a finishing flag? Did they play checkers and chess? Is it the Purina Dog Chow Company logo? One day I looked at it and I said, stop looking at the white, look at the purple. And it just jumped right off the belt. Those are turtles. In our creation story, Sky Woman came to earth and was placed on the back of a turtle that rose up from the depths of the water. So it would be natural for Iroquoian people to associate land with a turtle. So there you go. So there's 7 of those emblems on there, so that's why I link it to the 7 nations. Don't know for sure. That next belt, I should show you a little bit more of it. There's a famous lithograph of a Huron chief in the McCord Museum holding this belt, and he's going like that. That's a Wendouree chief who explained the belt to the British. He went to England and took the belt with him. And some of the stories about this belt link it to a peace council in 1760. At the end of the 7 Years' War, when the so-called 7 Nations of Canada switched sides from the French to the British to protect their communities. So we believe this was given at a peace council shortly after the war, given to the 7 Nations by the Iroquois Confederacy and the British. And then this one is a repatriated belt. This was in the New York State Museum for years and years, about a century. It was collected at Akwesasne by Harriet Maxwell Converse. And she bought it from a guy named Chief Running Deer, who wasn't really a chief, but a performer in the Wild West shows. He got it from his aunt, who was a descendant of Colonel Lewis Cook. And she showed it to a Civil War general by the name of Henry Carrington, and she gave him the lowdown on the belt. She says, "We will live together or we will die together. We promise this as long as waters run, skies do shine, and night brings rest." And she attributed the human figures to the chief of the 7 Nations and King George. And the 7 bands designate the 7 Nations of Canada. And so that's pretty accurate little oral tradition she laid on that general. He wanted to buy it from her, but she refused to sell it. So he went home empty-handed, but he did write it down, the story, and it was published in the Extra Census Bulletin from 1890, which you can find, I think Cornell University reprinted that one. So that's mentioned in there. So that's an interesting take on the belt. So we've repatriated this. The real belt has traces of red ochre, which you can even still see today. And what red ochre was war paint. You would take red ochre, mix it with bear grease. Our warriors would paint themselves head to toe with that stuff and then run into battle. When their musket was out of ammo and the enemy tried to grab them, they would slip out of their hands because they're just covered in grease. So that was one of our tactics for when we fought, is we'd strip down to a breechcloth and just smear ourselves with various colors, usually red ochre, black, and some of the other colors too. But the point was to look as garish and horrifying as possible, and to be, to have the enemy unable to grab you if it got down to hand-to-hand combat. So that's what I think they did, is they would paint a wampum belt with war paint to call our men to war. So if the British gave us this after the French and Indian War ended, when the Americans invaded the Montreal area at the beginning of the American Revolution, that's what I think happened, is the British took this belt, painted it with war paint to call our warriors to go and support the British. 100 of our warriors did. And our community being probably no more than about 300 at the time, that's a pretty big support to get a third of our population to go and join the war effort. So again, the War of 1812, same thing. British came and recruited our people to go and fight on this side of the British against the Americans. So again, they might have used the same tactic, paint the wolf belt with red war paint, call us to war. What they would do is they would paint it with war paint, and a guy would give this speech calling the young men to come, and then he would drop it on the ground, and then the warriors would get up, and whatever warrior, it was his right to choose whether his community was supporting the war or not. It was up to the warrior themselves to accept and go and fight. So he would go up, pick up the war belt, hold it up, let out a war cry, and then strike the war post with his war club, and then dance the war dance while some of the war party pounded on their war drums. Yeah, war, right? Well, those are all actually terms found in history books, every single one of them. So every time an Indian has anything, they add the word war to the front of it. War paint, war club, war belt, war party, war pony, you name it. War. So thank you. You're welcome. Anyway, so yeah, that's what I think happened with that belt, is that it was used to recruit our people. They said, hey, now you're part of the covenant chain with us. When we go to war, you go to war. That's the way it works. So you get to trade, live in peace, but when we go to war, you have to come with us. So we did. Now, this is the last one. This is a belt, another one from the New York State collection that was repatriated to the Confederacy in that first big repatriation that people still talk about. This was given back to Onondaga, and the story for this one is well known. It is said the 7 nations gave this to the Confederacy and promised to be peaceful. Well, that would have probably happened at the same council as those other 2 belts on the end here when they were passed back and forth, because that's what happens at councils, is you pass wampum belts back and forth. To accept it is to accept the message with it. So, yep, that's confirmed by oral traditions recorded by the Onondaga about this belt. So those are my 7 nations belts relating to their history. I have other belts that I usually take up 3 whole racks to do my presentations, but I decided for this one today, we're going to just zero in on the 7 nations of Canada and their belts, because they were into wampum. Even though they were Roman Catholics, they still did absolutely everything the same as they had before they became Catholic converts. They fought the same, they sang, they danced, they did ceremonies, they had clans, they had clan names, they were matrilineal. All of that stuff carried on into New France. Very little actually changed. And so the French capitalized on that. They said all our native warriors are just as ferocious as they ever were. So they didn't temper that. They didn't say, oh, now that you're a Catholic, you're going to have to fight with, softer tools. No. They said, you stay just as you are. When we need you, we'll call you. So anyway, we're just living up to our end of the bargain of being an ally to the colonists. So it's cost us dearly. There's a lot fewer of us today because of those wars, But then we could say the same about the American and Canadian populations today. Interesting thing, though, in Canada, there's no repatriation laws, not like in the States where we have had repatriations. So the belts that we have that are sitting in Canadian museums, there's no law compelling the owners to return them to us. But one good thing that did happen was last fall, the McCord Museum got to host some wampum belts that were returning from France. So the curator, a guy named Jonathan Laney, a Huron from Wendake, contacted all the museums in Canada that have wampum. And he knew of all kinds of very arcane collections and belts. He brought them all together for a big exhibit at the McCord. I think there was probably 50 wampum belts and colonial era artifacts like war clubs and medals and stuff that were on display. So I got to be a consultant with my buddy Jonathan and got to witness that incredible collection of wampum belts at the McCord, to see so many belts that I'd never even seen before, to see those epic belts from our history that are at the McCord, to see them all laid out in their glory. And to have that happen was quite a feather in my cap, quite a highlight of my history career. Hey, I just noticed there's a big banana in the back row there. Hey, Ace. I thought that was worth interrupting my spiel for. You don't get bananas that often, that big. But anyway, so I'm going to wrap it up at that. And I hope some of you will think my speech interesting enough to buy the book that has all of this history of Colonel Lewis Cook. Not all of it, because I had to write another whole book about it. But that one really meant a lot to me to get that book together. Because the story was, when the COVID epidemic hit in 2020, my wife, who's a nurse at the Cornwall Community Hospital, I got my whole government at the tribal council got shut down. We all got sent home, laid off actually. And my wife had to go to work every day. There was no layoff for the hospital. That's ground zero. So there she goes, trucking off to work into the Lion's Den, COVID Central Hospital. And there I am sitting like a schmuck on the couch, watching my fearless wife walk out the door. And so I said, I have to make the best of this time. So I fortunately had enough material. I started furiously writing this book, get it out into the world. I couldn't go on tour, obviously, since we're all on lockdown. Couldn't do all the book promotions of it, but I got it out there. I got it done because I said, I've got to make the best possible use of this time, because my wife is paying the price for me to be sitting here looking pretty on my couch. I've got to pay this back to her. So I dedicated the book to her and her coworkers at the hospital, who tirelessly went in and suffered, and she got COVID at some point. It affected her hearing. She wears a hearing aid. Her lungs are not the same. I lost my cousin. One of my cousins was one of those people that thought she didn't need to get a vaccine. She didn't need to mask. And she was a tough, strong, fearless person, but she succumbed. And it was the most tragic thing to know that her daughter and her grandchildren could not be there at the hospital when she passed and she was in a coma, and that they could only watch on a little monitor back at home while she was in a hospital. And so they were at least able to spend time singing songs to her, telling her how much they loved her, on this little device, a little tablet or whatever. So what an unreal thing for all of us to go through. The United States lost like 1 million people. The city of Ottawa has a population of 1 million people right now. So a whole city of people the United States has lost in that horrific thing. All of our ancestors, everybody that I talked about in this speech today, all of them witnessed and experienced epidemic devastation like that. Colonel Lewis, during the War of French and Indian War and the American Revolution, there were smallpox outbreaks in our communities that took people out. They don't get mentioned in all the war books, but 1850, my community had smallpox outbreak, 500 cases of smallpox. I don't know how many died. Still trying to find that out. 1830, we had cholera, tuberculosis. 100 people in one summer died in my community. Or actually 111 people died from one outbreak. So our ancestors have experienced that kind of trauma. It's in our DNA that that kind of thing can happen. So I think going through the pandemic, coming out on the other end, fortunately, made history a hell of a lot more personal for me. I don't know about how it did for you, but it made me think of what a price has been paid for all of us to be alive today. And so I wish everybody here the best of health going forward. I hope you and all of your families have a wonderful future. I hope all of the political nervousness that we all fear right now, I hope that all becomes a thing of the past and that people come together. I made a joke a while ago about, I said I drove through the Adirondacks to be here, and what a wonderful thing to do is drive through the Adirondacks and see all the beautiful fall colors, and I see a lot of men getting out of their cars and taking rifles out of their cars. It's either hunting season or there's an election coming up. So I'm hoping that election, political division and antagonism that's out there, I yearn for that to go away because I love the United States. I grew up being so patriotic as a kid. I love Canada. I'm not one of those native people that just sees them as colonizing colonizers who colonized. I don't really take that hard line anymore. Mostly because I live in Cornwall. My wife's not native. My kids are half native, half non-native. I just don't see a future of being in a camp. I draw strength from my humanity as a person. And I told my kids, because when you're half native and half white, you're going to hear it. You're going to hear that half-breed garbage. And you're going to be challenged from the white kids about how white you are. You're going to be challenged by native kids about how native you are. I told my kids from the very beginning, I said, don't worry about those labels. It's more important that you are an individual, that you as a person, as Jacob, Jade, and Elijah, it's more important who you are as individuals than any tag or any group you would ever want to be a part of. So live as an individual, be a person, not a thing, not a member of a group. Who you are as an individual is the most important thing. And I say that to anybody on this earth, is be the person that you are, not the member of a group that you think you are or wish to be. Because those groups won't be there at the very end. It'll be the family and people that you love that don't see you as a label or a tag or anything like that. That you are a human being first and foremost. You're a heart, you're a mind, you're a spirit. And that's what the creator of whatever meant for us to be. We're all united. We're all here on this earth. So I'm going to leave it at that kind thought and word. And thank you very much for entertaining my harangue for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions?
I think I covered it all. Wow.
I do have a quick question.
Sure.
So in Canada, is there any discussion of repatriating any of those belts? Even though there's
No law compelling them to do it? No. There's not really an effort, but I think Jonathan Laney's bringing all of the belts together began that dialogue. That museum people are seeing how much our own people love that, love to see what is there, you know. So we're fortunate, though. One of our chiefs, our former Grand Chief Abram Benedict, was recently elected to be the head chief of the Chiefs of Ontario, which is a big provincial organization of natives. So he's the first one from Akwesasne to be elected. So he's a good friend of mine. I'm going to urge him to promote that with the Parliament and the Legislature of Ontario to get that ball rolling, to see if we can't have some kind of measure of repatriation in Canada also that has some teeth to it, you know, that isn't just waiting for people to think about giving it back out of the kindness of their heart, but to have some law behind it. Okay, so yeah, that's where that stands right now. But hopefully someday.